CTS, family-friendly television.
Hi, and welcome to Rhonda London Live. On the show today, mandatory drug testing for welfare recipients. The Ontario government's controversial plan is now sitting in limbo. That's because it violates the province's Human Rights Code. Human Rights Commissioner Keith Norton says drug users cannot be denied welfare benefits because addiction is a handicap. The Ontario Court of Appeal has ruled that substance abusers are handicapped and entitled to the protection of the Human Rights Code. Still, the Harris government plans to make good on this election promise. The idea is to force addicts into treatment or cut them off of welfare. What do you think about all of this? Should welfare recipients face drug testing to ensure that none of your tax dollars are ever wasted on drugs? Or is it humiliating, punitive, and unhelpful to a group already struggling to cope? As always, the phones will be open to take your calls, so don't go away. We're back right after this. Human Rights Commissioner Keith Norton says the Ontario government's controversial drug testing plan for welfare recipients violates the Human Rights Code. Still, the Harris government seems committed to making good on this election promise. The idea is to force drug users into treatment programs. If they refuse, they're cut off benefits. With his thoughts on this, we're joined in studio by Joe Cordiano. He's the MPP for York South-Weston, and he's the Liberal Community and Social Services critic. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure to be here.
How committed do you think the Harris government is? It's been making a lot of noise, particularly last week, that it plans to go ahead with this controversial plan, although acknowledging that it has no way around at this point the human rights violation.
Well, I think that the government would like the benefit that comes with talking about welfare reform and talking about welfare recipients in any way, shape, or form that the public deems to be something with regard to eliminating abuses. And certainly drug abuse is not something that anyone would want to tolerate in our society. But, you know, it begs the question, is the government really actually going to go through with this? There are many barriers to the government's successfully going through with this. As you've pointed out, in addition to that, the Charter of Rights is also a question mark with regard to this law. So, and in the U.S., the Supreme Court ruled that the state of Michigan, its law to test welfare recipients for drugs was invalid as well.
What are your feelings on this plan?
Well, you know, I think that there's a larger question here with regard to the rights of individuals and with regard to people in general, what individual rights they have. If the government's able to do this, to bring in a law that you know, goes through the legislature and in effect to test welfare recipients for drug abuse, where does the government stop with its testing and mandatory requirements? I mean, next it could be anybody on the list, any other group in our society. That's what concerns me. Furthermore, you know, when it comes to welfare recipients, it's been shown that they're no greater in terms of drug abuse than the general populace. 6% of all welfare recipients have been identified as drug abusers. That's about the same for the general populace. So why pick on welfare recipients?
Do you think the government is definitely picking on welfare recipients?
Well, I think it's you know, if the government's intent was to deal with drug abuse and to help people get back on their feet, to deal with their addiction and put them through treatment centers, then I think it would be a noble effort, a noble cause. Is that really the case when we find out that the treatment centers in Ontario are woefully inadequate and that there are in fact waiting lists for people to get to these treatment centers? The funding for the treatment centers has been reduced significantly. There just aren't the dollars that are going into these treatment facilities. The Research Addiction Center has merged with other organizations, and as a result, there are fewer of these treatment centers available to drug addicts. So I think that resources should go into treatment centers, and the effort should be made for the general population at large, and not just with welfare recipients. I think the government ought to be doing that.
Even if the number of drug users among welfare recipients is on par with the general populace, and we're talking about a relatively small number, as you suggested, 6%, what mechanism should be in place to prevent any tax dollars? I work really hard to pay my taxes, and it really bothers me to think that even a couple of those dollars could be spent on buying illegal drugs. So what mechanism should prevent that from happening?
Well, I don't know that you could prevent that from happening in any case with anyone in our society, regardless of whether they receive welfare dollars or any other kind of dollars. I mean, what about people that are employed by the government at large in the public service? I mean, these are tax dollars. Yes, they're working for their wages, but now the government has people working for their wages on welfare as well through workfare, or getting an education, or doing something for their welfare dollars. So, I mean, the principle in law is how do you distinguish between the two groups then at that point? I don't see how you can do that. If it's good for one, it ought to be good for the other. And I think that that's the danger here, the precedent that you're setting.
But is it a kindness, though, to hand over a welfare check to someone who's going to spend it on crack?
No, and I think that, all of us, as I say, it would be a noble cause to ensure that people aren't abusing drugs and to get them back into productive lifestyles. But, at what cost to our individual rights and freedoms? As a democratic society, we have to weigh that. We have to weigh the costs of, a big autocratic government controlling our own individual rights and freedoms. And I think you have to strike a proper balance there. I don't think that this law would strike a proper balance. I think that it would tip the scales, and the government would then be in a position to do other things that I think would violate our own rights and freedoms.
Do you think it's a slippery slope? Well, for instance, provincial dollars pay for our some of our highways. So should you have a mandatory drug test before you can use a provincial highway?
Well, and then that's the next question.
So
it opens the door to all sorts of testing for all kinds of reasons. And I think that...
Well, before you get your tax refund, you should be able to submit to mandatory drug testing.
Where does it end? So at that point, the question is, where does it end? How far can the government go? And once it sets a precedent, such as this would be, in the case of drug testing for welfare recipients, then the government would be justified, I think, could make a case legally that it could do all sorts of other things that would be unpalatable to most of us in a free and democratic society.
But sometimes, though, don't you need a carrot and a stick approach? Because if you have people who have come so far down and they are relying on social assistance, and quite frankly, Joseph, I have no idea how anybody can live on what welfare pays. To me, it's such a small and paltry amount, particularly for people living in the Greater Toronto area. But if you're so down and out that that's what you're living on, and if you have a drug habit on top of that, maybe, sometimes you do have to be cruel to be kind. Maybe you have to say, look, if you don't get treatment, we're not giving you any more money.
Well, I think what we ought to do is start by saying to people, why not make these programs more available? I mean, people genuinely are interested in dealing with their problem. The problem is that there aren't the facilities, there aren't the spaces available at these treatment centers. You have to wait a long period of time. And I think we ought to start by adding resources to those treatment centers so that they are available, so that more people would access them. I think you would find that people would move in that direction in a positive way. And yes, there are always going to be people who are abusers of any kind, and that's, I'm not sure if that's my cell phone or not.
Okay, your phone is ringing and our phones are ringing, so we're going to take a commercial break. Want to hear your thoughts on this? The number to call is 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. We're back with more Rhonda London Live after this. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Should there be mandatory drug testing for welfare recipients? That's the question we're asking today. The Ontario government says the answer is yes. Want to hear your thoughts on this. The number to call is 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. We're joined in studio by Joseph Cordiano. He's the Liberal Social Services and Community and Social Services critic. Before we went to commercial break, you were talking about the fact that this is a slippery slope. If you start drug testing welfare recipients, what's going to be next? The person who gets their tax refund might have to submit to random drug testing. But do you think just the fact that we're even having this discussion, that the government seems fairly committed to moving forward with this legislation or with this program, do you think it could possibly have a chilling effect? That people who have a drug problem and might be on social assistance right now, that they might even be afraid, if they're fortunate enough to get one of those few spots in a treatment center, that they might be afraid to go forward for help for fear that they might be targeted for the rest of their career on social assistance.
And that's a huge danger with any sort of mandatory testing. Whether it's for drugs or for genetic disposition to disease, for example. I mean, that's a huge question that has to be dealt with in this country, given the kind of DNA genome testing that's been done and the advances made with regard to that and the predisposition to diseases. I think that's a huge question of that all of us will have to deal with in terms of privacy and how we insure ourselves. And an employer, a prospective employer, could say, "I'm not going to hire you because you have a predisposition to diabetes, for example, or cancer, or any number of other diseases, which may affect them in the long run." So, I mean, that's a huge question to be delved into. Public policy has not addressed that question.
Okay, well, our phones are ringing. Let's go to Sandra on line 1. Go ahead, Sandra. You're on the air.
Hi, Rhonda.
Hi, Sandra. Go ahead. You're on the air.
Oh, wow, this is something. I've been watching CTS for a while because I am awaiting drug treatment.
Right.
I had a breakdown, and I've been on social services since then, with proper documentation from everyone.
Right.
And I just got a call on Friday, or Monday, actually, when I picked up my messages. And I'm detoxing right now, so that's why I'm a bit shaky. And I have a chance to go in on this Friday, but I have no one to look after my son because I'm a single mom. So we're trying to work that out because I have been detoxing myself since last Wednesday, and it seems to be getting much worse instead of better. Yeah. But I really agree with the guy there. And when I first heard the question about should we be tested, it comes to me to say yes, we should be, because we shouldn't be out loud. And yes, that tough love. And that was when I first started watching the show today. Okay, so and then when I heard, I don't even know the guy's name.
Joseph Cordiano.
Oh, hi, Joseph.
Hi, how are you?
I heard it at the beginning, but I'm sorry, I'm just all over the place. But your answers are so good. I mean, my brother has been looking for help for 8 years, and he's 9 months clean now, and he's finally found the thing. But for me, what really freaks me out is you're just on your own. You're totally on your own, and trying to fight your way into a place and I wasn't all that bad. I was just using some Valium and some marijuana. Okay, but they've gotten into me so deep now that people don't even look at those as drugs, really. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a good point. Sandra, thank you so much for your phone call. Interesting perspective, because here's somebody who is clearly grappling with this problem, is on social assistance, and yet on one hand, she agrees with you, but then she also can see the merit of drug testing.
Well, I mean, drug testing is a good thing, but does it have to be mandatory? Does it have to be, do we have to conscript people into it? I think that if we made it available to people in the sense that you test for drugs and then you provide treatment at the same time. I mean, it's no use having drug testing if you're not going to have treatment. So I think that's the essential point. You've got to have the treatment facilities available for people who are abusing drugs. And I think that that's not available in Ontario today. It's woefully inadequate in terms of the facilities that are available and the dollars that are going into this from the government.
Do you think that could be the one positive thing if this program, and that's a big if at this stage in the game, if this program were to move forward, could that be the one positive benefit? Is that, you know, even the Harris government would not have the unmitigated gall to do mandatory drug testing and threaten to cut people off of welfare without providing treatment.
Well, you know, ultimately that would be
the
the true test of success or failure. How many people are actually treated? And if this led to greater treatment facilities, greater number of resources being dedicated to treatment facilities, then I think that it would be a positive step. On the other hand, do we have to have a mandatory requirement? And why just welfare recipients? Then it begs the question, should everyone in society be tested for drug abuse? Everyone who has a driver's license potentially is a dangerous liability on our highways and roads. So, you know, that's what, 6-7 million drivers across the province? Potentially a hazardous situation for all of us. Should we test everyone for drugs that has a driver's license?
That's a good point. That's an excellent point. Well, our phones are quite busy. Let's go to Vicky on line 8. Go ahead, Vicky. You're on the air.
Hello?
Hi, Vicky. Go ahead. You're on the
Hi.
air.
How are you?
Great. Go ahead.
What? Hello? Hi, sorry.
Yeah, Vicky, you were on the air. Go ahead.
Okay. I was just watching your show since I really like you, and I really disagree with this.
Okay.
Really. I mean, there is no reason why they should get tested. It's insulting. It's really insulting because, I mean, I work, and I mean, I've seen people that use welfare, and more people that aren't on welfare use, like, it's like your friend there, I don't know his name.
Joseph Cordiano.
What he was saying is definitely true. And not because you're on welfare means you use drugs. And if they're going to bring them into, I mean, it's insulting. It's really insulting because my mother was on welfare for a long time, and it's just because she had a lot of, people have bad lives, and it doesn't mean because you have a bad life you're going to do drugs, and not because you're on welfare you're going to do drugs.
Okay, Vicky, thank you so much for your phone call. She brings up some excellent points. And every time drug testing in our society is associated with anything, it's usually criminal behavior. For instance, there's drug testing if you're pulled over for impaired driving, or under Nova Scotia law, if you're suspected of child abuse for a 12-month period, you could be subject to random drug testing. It's all associated with criminal behavior. So what message is being sent here? That being on welfare is criminal behavior?
Well, but from this government, definitely. I think the overtones are there. You know, and right from the outset, since this government was elected, they have treated welfare recipients as almost as we see criminals. I mean, the stigma attached to receiving welfare in this province is huge now. It's such a negative stigma. And I think that the government has, you know, had every intention of doing this because it's a popular thing out there with the electorate to deal with welfare abusers and cheaters. And while all of us think it's a noble effort in terms of eliminating abuse in our system, at what cost? There are a lot of innocent people out there who have had difficulties that are beyond their control, and we need to help them. Rather than pushing them further down, we need to help them get back on their feet. Okay. This is not doing it.
We've got time for one more phone call. Let's go to Chris on line 8. Go ahead, Chris. You're on the air.
Hi there, Rhonda.
Hi, Chris.
How are you doing?
Great.
Great. Well, I've been on both sides of the coin. I've been on social assistance a few years back when I became a young single parent. I'm now, you know, I've returned to school and I'm now working. But I truly believe as a taxpayer that people should be subject to this. As same as work for welfare. You know, if you're receiving a welfare check, then, you know, you're a public book. You're open to the taxpayers, and we shouldn't be paying people to be able to go out and buy drugs and sit at home and not work. But on the same point, I also agree that, you know, it shouldn't. I don't think it should be disclosed to potential employers or anyone in that such manner. If it's tested positive, it should be kept privately.
Okay, Chris, thank you so much for your phone call. I'll let you respond to that.
Well, it is a privacy issue. It is a question of how much information is about you individually is available to prospective employers, to governments generally, and where, what safety and security do we have with regard to the protection of that information? The Privacy Commissioner has raised all kinds of alarm bells with regard to our information being given to private sector and organizations that use that information. These questions all need to be resolved through public policy. And those questions are not being resolved right now. We have no legislation that is truly protective of individual privacy. And, in Ottawa, that's the same thing. The Human Resources Commission, that department released some information that it shouldn't have, or is gathering information that it shouldn't. And here in Ontario, the same thing was done with the Ministry of Finance. They released information that they shouldn't have. The laws are sketchy on this. And so I think before we move forward with mandatory drug testing or any other kinds of testing of individuals and the gathering of information about individuals, we need to have watertight laws that deal with privacy.
Okay, Joseph Cordiano, our time has gone, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the show. It's always nice talking to you.
Pleasure to be here.
Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation, hear a much different perspective, and I also want to hear your thoughts on this. The number to call is 905-332-3131. We're back with more right after this. Today we're talking about the Ontario government's controversial plan to implement mandatory drug testing for welfare recipients. If they test positive, they have two options: to accept treatment or to be cut off welfare. With his thoughts on all of this, we're joined by Robert Metz. He's the founding member and the president of the Freedom Party of Ontario. Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think about this idea? And we should state that right now the plan is in limbo because it has hit a major stumbling stone in that it violates the Human Rights Code in this province. But the Harris government seems fairly committed to still moving forward, if at all possible. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think they're certainly responding to a popular sentiment, and it's an understandable one. As a taxpayer who is being forced to support a welfare system, it's a little untenable to find out that some of the people who are receiving our money as taxpayers are in fact perhaps using drugs or engage in other bad habits that are causing their dependency upon the state, so that we shouldn't be enabling this behavior, because to do so would be doing exactly that. And but I'm a little miffed about the concept here that everyone keeps using the word mandatory. It's reminiscent of the workfare scheme, where we're forcing people to work, when it's not true at all. What we're doing is saying that if you want this benefit, you have to do this. And if you don't do this, you're not going to jail, we're not going to lock you up, we're not going to do anything like that, you're just not going to get the benefit. It's a plain trade, simple. Employers do it all the time to their employees. I know many employees who work for certain companies who are subject to routine and constant drug testing because they're in positions where they're operating dangerous machinery or things of that nature. And I don't see this as an all and out blanket attack on everyone in society. I think there's a very specific relationship here.
But there's a difference, though. Let's say if I'm working at a nuclear reactor and I'm in a very sensitive position. When I accept that job, it's on the proviso that I submit to random drug testing. So at least I have the freedom to make that choice. If I find myself out of work and out of a job and I end up on social assistance, I don't know of anybody who really chooses that lifestyle, or at least I have never met anybody who would choose that lifestyle. So you don't have that element of choice. You don't have that agreement.
It's funny how we're always worried about the choice of the recipient of the benefit, but the person who's really being forced into the mandatory situation here is a taxpayer.
Right.
And nobody even brings up the fact that the taxpayer should have a choice, and that's basically my solution to the problem. We have to have voluntary welfare systems. We have to have systems where people give from the goodness of their heart, where they have control over the people who they're giving it to, how it's being given, under what conditions it's being given. We view welfare today as an entitlement, and that in itself creates a whole host of problems. And of course, the other side of the equation, when we're talking about drug abuse and issues of you know, I don't distinguish between legal or illegal drugs. I think the same rules should apply to both. Personally, I don't even think we should have drug prohibition laws. But that's an entirely separate issue. I think what
well,
is
that's
being...
fair enough, because alcoholism can be just as debilitating
Absolutely.
as cocaine addiction.
Or cigarettes. And is the issue really the debilitating part of it, or the fact, what really upsets the taxpayer? The fact that the person's being debilitated, or the fact that he's spending his money on a habit he may not approve of, and that he doesn't think that that's the situation? For example, even cigarettes might fall into that category. Should a person who is receiving money that has been forced out of the pockets of someone else be able to spend it on any luxury or anything like that? I don't think that welfare should be there to make people comfortable. In fact, I believe that discomfort should be a major part of any welfare system. That's the big incentive to get people off of welfare.
Well, I think welfare has become pretty uncomfortable, Robert, in this province.
Well, if that were the case, then the roles wouldn't be expanding as much as they tell us they are. Now, of course, I think in the real sense of the whole situation, I think the Harris government is only using these kinds of things as a sort of a disincentive to people to get off welfare. I feel the same way about workfare. I feel the same way about this kind of thing. But certainly the issue of mandatory, I don't think applies to these circumstances.
How do you feel about the fact that alcoholism, cocaine addiction, marijuana addiction has been classified as a handicap?
Oh, that's absolutely absurd.
That comes from the Ontario Court of Appeal.
Well, that fits with the basic philosophy of the way the courts are running these days. But nevertheless, it's absurd. You cannot, it's unlike a disease. Anybody who smokes a cigarette, takes any form of drug, did so voluntarily. And unless they can argue physically that someone forced this drug into them, then they don't have that argument to fall back on. I just don't buy it. The fact is, everyone knows what the long-term consequences are. You know, I don't really think there are any bad drugs, but there are bad habits. And they don't not necessarily always even relate to drugs. What about gambling? What would we do with welfare recipients who we find are gambling all their welfare money away? Should we have the right as taxpayers through the government to investigate these kinds of things? I would say yes, absolutely, just as any private agency would have the right to do some kind of means test for the people that it's giving help to.
But in a free and democratic society, if I elect to gamble away my meager welfare check, shouldn't that be my choice? Shouldn't that be my
If the money was given
freedom?
to you voluntarily, but you said free and democratic. Remember, the taxpayer is not free in this situation, and nor is there any democracy being offered him. The taxpayer is on the hook for everything. So if it was equal on both sides, I might agree with that, but it's all tilted to the one side. It seems as though the recipient of the benefit has all the rights, and the payers of the benefits have all the obligations and no say at all in how their money is being spent.
Okay, I want to talk to you more about that. I also want to talk to you, our viewers, and our phones are quite busy today. The number to call is 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. We're back with more right after these messages. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. The question we're asking today, should drug testing be mandatory for welfare recipients? We're joined in studio by Robert Metz. He's the founding member and the president of the Freedom Party of Ontario. Robert, you don't like the term mandatory, but I think it does fit in this instance.
Well, it does, as far as the taxpayer is concerned. He's being forced to support the whole system, but the welfare recipient is not being forced to go on welfare. They have to apply in some way. So to suggest that what they're doing is mandatory doesn't even make sense from a dictionary point of view as far as I'm concerned. I think it's a way of clouding the issue so that we can sneak in a lot of other mandatory things that are going to be foisted upon the taxpayer. I think the issues of drug rehabilitation and all the rest are separate issues from this. And I could agree with a lot of the things that Joe said in the last segment about basic drug rehabilitation programs available for people who need them. But that certainly is far removed from this particular issue as I would see it.
Okay, our phones are quite busy today. Let's go to Bobby on line 7. Go ahead, you're on the air.
Hi.
Hi, Bobby.
I just want to, make a couple of comments here. One is that this is typical of the campaign of greed that Mike Harris has swept across Ontario. As far as mandatory drug testing goes, if we're going to start to mandatory, order people to be accountable, I want to start at the level where the largest tax dollar is spent, which is in the government. So I believe that if we're going to do mandatory drug testing on the basis that the taxpayer has a right to know and a right to hold people accountable for the spending of the money, we need to start where the largest dollars are spent, which is on the level of government. So that would mean that any government employee, right down to city workers, right into our parliament, should be drug tested on a regular basis. Because these people are paid by form of paycheck by the taxpayer as opposed to welfare, does not reduce them from the responsibility. What's alarming to me here is that I see mandatory drug testing because a lot of the people who live on social assistance, when you say that they're there by choice, I beg to differ. I've worked extensively with kids in Children's Aid. A lot of the children on our streets and a lot of the young mothers on welfare, in fact, have been a ward of the courts for many years and are dealing with long-term psychological problems that come from a system that does not adequately address the needs of our children. And so what we're doing is we're creating the problem and then abdicating and saying, hey, we're not responsible for the problem. This is a campaign to punish the poor and the disenfranchised in our country. What Mike Harris will accomplish, and I'll just say that with the women that have been killed recently by their spouses, Mike Harris should be very happy because they're no longer on the welfare system and there is no support there for them. Now, if we say mandatory drug testing and that will remove you from the welfare rolls, well, you're right. Our welfare roll will be cut in half and our street population will double. And that's all it's going to accomplish. But unfortunately, what I see happening in our country is people embracing this attitude of greed. And then we look at our children and we wonder why they don't have compassion for other people.
Okay, Bobby, I'm going to stop you there because you brought up some excellent points and I want Robert to have a chance to respond to that. Your thoughts?
Well, again, she's using the word mandatory in a way that I would not use it. But again,
well, if you have to choose
she also said that half of the people are on drugs. So do we want accountability somewhere or don't we? I mean, if by having this test we're going to remove, as she says, half the people off of the drug rolls, well, then that tells us something, doesn't it? Although I don't think the statistic personally is that high. But nevertheless, where do you start? I would agree, sure, if you want to have drug or government employees drug tested, you can do that too if you think that it's necessary or that there's a problem emanating from that quarter. But again, the issue is, do governments really care about the people that they purport to help? I don't know why she's using this word greed. I don't know how that fits into the equation. It sounds like there's another agenda at work there.
Well, many people would say that this is picking on the poor. And I don't want
who's greedy? Who's the greedy person in this?
Robert,
the taxpayer who wants to keep his own money?
I don't want this to get bogged down in an argument about semantics, but what choice, mandatory to me would be, what choice do you have if you have no other alternative or no alternative that you see? If you're looking at paying the rent or putting food on the table or submitting to a drug test, I call that mandatory.
If you want that benefit strong enough to submit to the drug test, then you are making that choice. We're still regardless. Mandatory means, and it can only mean this when we're talking politics, is that when you don't do it, you go to jail. That's what mandatory means. And there's no issue of that occurring here, which I don't even understand, considering that we have governments that believe we should have drug laws that make these things illegal in the first place. And that's the major thing that concerns me. I don't want to see this kind of a program turn the province or the country into a police state, because I think we've already been walking down that road quite a bit with our drug laws. But the other issue is there is no issue of punishment if a person refuses the drug test. Then they either have to go to their family for help, go to a private agency for help, go to some outside agency for help, but not to the government that has said, if you want our help, you must do X. And if you don't do X, then you go to someone else for help. I just can't see that as being mandatory in any way, shape, or form.
Robert Metz, our time is gone, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the show.
Thank you.
Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation, hear a much different perspective when we come back. Also want to hear your thoughts. The number to call is 416-203-0302. Despite rulings from Human Rights Commissioner Keith Norton and the Ontario Court of Appeal, the Harris government seems committed to its plan to drug test welfare recipients. Joining our conversation, Andrea Calver of the Ontario Coalition for Social Justice. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
So how do you feel about this plan? Here we've had a ruling from Keith Norton who says, you know, to the government, you cannot go ahead with this plan. It violates the Human Rights Code. But at the same time, we're hearing noise from the government that, you know, yes, this is an obstacle, but they're committed to finding a way around it.
Well, what bothers me is the government says that they need to introduce drug testing so that people on welfare can get a job. But we already know what the barriers are for people on welfare to getting a job. And there are areas that the government has cut back. I mean, the big barriers for people getting off welfare are childcare, you know, having an outfit to wear to a job interview, having enough TTC or transit money to get yourself to an interview. Those are the really big barriers. And those are the areas that this government has cut back and cut back and cut back. All of this talk about drug testing is really just to stigmatize a really vulnerable group of people. We've already heard that there would be some people on welfare who use drugs, but they would be in the same, you know, same as everywhere else. So
Joseph Cordiano uses that figure of about 6%, which is supposed to be on par with the general population.
You see, you know, the government, in saying they want to introduce drug testing, they want to package it up like they're doing people a favor. And the truth is, this is one more mechanism to kick more people off of welfare. It's another bureaucratic way that they can kick people off welfare, and people on drugs get caught up in that, but so do a lot of other people who have to come in for drug testing, can't make their appointments, or it's in another town. The welfare system is a big, complex system, and whenever there are these mandatory things, these mandatory rules, a lot of people get caught up in that, and it's very unfortunate because for the Harris government, this is a way of kicking people off welfare. It's not about treatment.
What happens if a person is unable to stay clean?
Well, let's look what happens if someone loses their welfare. They're going to end up in the streets. They're going to lose their apartment. If they have kids, those kids are going to end up in children's aid. And that's not any kind of rebuilding of your life. I mean, the government is just taking a bomb underneath people's lives, whether they're using drugs or whether they aren't, in trying to get people to do the mandatory drug testing. So it's going to be a huge problem for a lot of people. It's going to lead to more people on our streets, more people in the city shelters, and that's not good for any of us. I want to remind people that this government cut a $37 nutrition benefit for moms on welfare so they wouldn't spend the money on beer. I mean, they just don't have any credibility when they say to people on welfare, we care about you and we want to help you. And this drug treatment stuff is packaged as, we care about you and we want to help you. In reality, they just want to move people off of welfare.
But Andrea, we've all heard the anecdotal stories about families on welfare and their kids, you know, 3 days after they've got their check, their kids are starving to death, there's no food in the house, but yet, you know, the mom and dad are buying beer and cigarettes.
I kind of turn that around to the government because, of course, you've said that you can't live on welfare. You can't have the apartment, the food, right? You need to make the choice, feed the kids or pay the rent. And here there's money to be spent, and drug testing is very expensive. And what is the government doing with money to be spent? They're going to waste it on drug testing instead of actually giving it to people so they can feed their kids. So I kind of turn that back on the government. If they've got money to spend, then pregnant women should get their $37 nutritional supplement back, and we should be able to have it so that mostly single moms on welfare can both pay the rent and feed the kids. If there's money to be spent in welfare, then let's give it back to people so they can have a decent standard of living.
Okay, our phones are ringing. Let's go to Claudette on line 7. Go ahead, Claudette, you're on the air.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
I'm so glad that I kicked into this program because it's so close to my heart. Had there been drug testing back when my daughter was still alive, she would still be alive today. I really believe that this is something we have to do, and not only this, but improve the lives of our welfare throwaways. Had my daughter been tested for drugs, she could have gotten the proper mental help that she needed because she was also mentally ill. And had she gotten that proper mental health care from a qualified social worker and then on to a psychiatrist, she would have not murdered her baby and herself. So I do believe we have to put up these guidelines to make sure that a mentally ill person is not becoming worse because of drugs. And then, inevitably, in my daughter's case, having to turn to an unlicensed therapist who milks the money of welfare moms and turns her against her parents. Had proper medical help in there, she'd still be alive today.
Okay, Claudette, thank you so much for sharing your story. You can hear the pain in her voice, and she raises a good point. Andrea, it bothers me, the idea. It does seem to me to be a terrible invasion of privacy if you're going to say just because you're on welfare, that means you could be subject to a drug test. But on the other hand, how much of a kindness is it to give a welfare check, as paltry as it is, to a crackhead?
I wish that the services were available for people like her daughter. And the truth is they aren't. And my greatest fear is that it's exactly people like her daughter that'll be most hurt by this, in that instead of getting help, they'll actually just get kicked off welfare and be in the streets. So my greatest fear is that this isn't about actually helping people. It's not about actually getting people into treatment programs, because those programs either don't exist or have huge waiting lines. And of course, here in Ontario, you can see a psychiatrist under OHIP for free. Well, to get an appointment with one of those psychiatrists, you could wait a decade. My greatest fear is that people like her daughter, instead of getting the help, would get drug tested and kicked off welfare, and they would just end up in the streets.
All right, let's go to Connie on line 1. Go ahead, Connie, you're on the air.
Hi.
Hi, Connie.
Thanks very much for taking my call.
My pleasure.
It's I've sort of gone through the emotional roller coaster with all your guests, and I can't see that there was much sense with some of them. I just feel like Big Brother is here.
Right.
And your last speaker was talking about, we poor taxpayers. Well, rather see the tax money going to welfare, who, by the way, in the city I'm in, they only get a little over $600. How can you feed and clothe yourself and pay? It's expensive here to even rent a room in someone's house. I mean, you don't have money left over.
Okay, Connie, thank you so much for your phone call. She brings up a good point. Of course, I'm sure anybody who knows anything about addiction knows just how desperate and how debilitating addiction can be. It wouldn't be unusual for someone to spend their whole welfare check the very first day that they get it on drugs if they are addicted. But on the other hand, as Connie has suggested, we're not talking about an awful lot of money.
No, we're not. I mean, most people on welfare, a single person would get $530, and it can be hard to rent even a room in someone's house for $300 or $400. And this is where we hear the really sad stories. Most of the caseload of welfare are single mothers and their children. And that's because single mothers face the greatest barriers to getting back to work. Again, ironically, employment is a big reason. The government says that it needs to drug test people so that people can get back to work, because drugs are a barrier. But we know what those barriers are for all of those single mothers. It's really childcare, and it's really the ability to go back to work, and it's low skills. And those are all of the areas that get cut by this government. So we're making it harder for some women to get off welfare. And again, I don't know how people survive either. You literally face the choice of paying the rent or feeding the kids. And we have a lot of families on food bank diets in Ontario because welfare is not enough to live on.
Indeed. We have to take a commercial break, but don't go away. We'll be back with more Rhonda London Live right after these messages, so stay with us. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. We have time for one more phone call. Let's go to Marie on line 7. Go ahead, Marie. You'll have to make it quick, though. We're running out of time.
Yes, hi. I'd just like to say that I think the Mike Harris government should leave the welfare people and the poor people alone and deal with problems that are much more greater than that. I work with the Salvation Army.
Right.
And we have, like, since the Mike Harris government has taken over, our caseloads have, like, tripled. And I understand that there are people that are on welfare that do drugs, but not everybody on welfare does drugs.
Marie, that's an excellent point, and I want to thank you so much for your phone call. Do you feel that the Harris government is simply picking on the poor because they're an easy target?
Yes, I do. And the thing they are proudest of is lowering the welfare rolls. And they don't really care what happens to people when they leave welfare. All they care is the numbers go down. And so I think drug testing is just one more way of kicking people off welfare, and those are people that will end up in our city streets and in our shelters. Absolutely most people on welfare don't do drugs, and it's very unfortunate that everyone out there will associate drug use with people on welfare. It's completely not true, but it serves the government's goals just fine to point to people on welfare as undeserving. And
do you think if anything positive could come out of this, though, if the government is successful in moving forward with the program, is that it would have to open up the door to more treatment facilities and more treatment spaces?
I just don't think it does have to. I mean, we have a crisis already on our streets. Walk around our streets. There's all kinds of people with addictions and mental illness, and nothing is happening for those people right now.
Andrea, I want to thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks.
That is our show for today. Thanks so much for watching. Tomorrow on the show, labor unrest. The Harris government is taking a lot of criticism these days for its white paper on employment standards. We'll tell you why all the heat. That's coming up tomorrow on the show. I hope you'll join me. In the meantime, have a great afternoon.
You're watching CTS, family-friendly television.